So, we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, and we haven't been going through these things in perfect order, but we've been going through the Beatitudes, or what I would consider is the attitude that you should have if you want to have part in Jesus Christ's kingdom. As Jesus Christ is setting up primarily at this point his eternal kingdom. And if you want a part in that kingdom, what sort of attitude ought you to have? So Jesus lists all of these attitudes called the Beatitudes. And we haven't gone through them in perfect order. I've tried to pair some together that went with each other so that it didn't take me quite so long to get through these attitudes. But we have two left. We have the attitude of the merciful, and we have the attitude of the peacemakers. And as we look at the attitude of mercy today, we're going to be talking about God's judgment being greater on people who are not merciful, and how the people who are judgmental will face a heavier judgment. And I've told you this many times, and I'm just going to say it again, just because this to me is probably one of the scariest things in the whole Bible for me. This just terrifies me, to be honest, because James says in James 3:1, he says, "Not many of you should become teachers and preachers, my brothers, because you know that those of us who teach are going to be judged with a greater strictness." And I think, man, that's not good. What would you give in exchange to be judged less strictly? There's no amount of money that would be worth that. There's nothing I can think of that would be worth being judged with great strictness. Who on earth would want to bring that upon themselves? That's just it makes me want to quit today. In closing, that is not a fun thought by any means. And I can tell you that it bothers me enough that you've heard me say it many, many times. And it bothers me enough that I think the only reason I continue to do this is because I believe that it's a sacrifice that God would ask me to make. And I hope that I can just teach in humility and say, guys, I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm not trying to say I've got it all together. I'm not trying to say I'm perfect. But if I believe that God has called me to use me to say this is the law, this is what we're supposed to do, carefully, it's a serious thing to incur judgment on yourself. It's not something that you want to do. It's not something that I would want to do by any means. And as I tell you things, as I say, this is God's expectation for you, God's saying, yep, I remember that. You said this is God's expectation for you, and he's saying you just incurred accountability on yourself. And that is not a fun thought at all. This reminds me of a movie. This is a movie I've referenced before. Not because it's a good movie, just because I don't know why. It's just a crazy movie. But in this movie, I watched it growing up, and I don't know, these movies I watched growing up stick in my head, but it's a Mad, Mad World, Mad World, whatever. And these people are racing across the countryside, chasing this money that's maybe stolen, maybe not. But anyway, all these people just get in all this huge trouble as they're going through. They all end up in prison, in the hospital. I mean, it's just a reckless movie. They're all chasing after this money. But the sheriff, he steps in and he's trying to tell them, this is the law, and he's trying to, give guidelines. But the truth is, in the end, he's trying to steal the money himself. And so what happens in the end of the movie? They're all laying in the hospital, and they're all waiting for their sentencing. They're all in this, whatever it is, in police custody, but they're in the hospital. And they're all saying to the sheriff, they're saying, boy, we're just people. But, I hope you rot in jail. Why? Because he is the sheriff. He gives the law. He's the one telling them these things. They're like, I hope you get it hard, And he says, you know what? He's like, you're probably all going to get off easy because the judge has got me to throw the book at. He says that's how it works. When you're someone who gives the laws, when you're someone who says this is how it is and you break it, he's like, yeah, you're going to get it. You're going to receive punishment. So as we look at this in verse 7, Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." So as we look at this, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Some people look at this and they say, well, this is one of those do unto others as you wish they would do unto you. And maybe, but is there any guarantee that if you're merciful to people that they're going to be merciful to you? Is there that's definitely going to happen? Because, I don't know if that was meant to pop up. But anyway, there we go. But anyway, is there any guarantee that if you're merciful to people that people are going to be merciful to you? Jesus was merciful. He was merciful to the hurt and the needy and the paralyzed, and he was merciful. And they crucified him. The disciples, they sawed them in two. They tormented and crucified them as well. There's not really a guarantee in this life of mercy. In fact, we just looked at how Jesus said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and say all manners of evil against you falsely on my account. He says, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. He says, if you've got this attitude and you're following me, you're one of these people who are going to receive the kingdom. He says, in fact, why don't you just count on being persecuted? Why don't you count on not receiving mercy? Why don't you count on life being difficult and hard? Why don't you count on this being a hard road and know that you're on your way to the kingdom of heaven, because so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. He says that you come from a long line of being persecuted for righteousness' sake, being persecuted for the right thing. So when he says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy, what is he talking about? Doesn't sound like they're going to receive mercy, does it? But I believe this all boils down to the same thing that I've said through all of these things. Each of these attitudes are those who will receive the kingdom of heaven. Each of these attitudes are those who will receive mercy from Jesus Christ. Each of these attitudes are those who are going to enter eternity and be called the sons of God. And you remember, as we looked at these parables, this is a major teaching through all of Jesus Christ's ministry. And as we've gone through all these parables, we've been on the teaching of Jesus Christ for quite some time. Do you remember when we looked at the parable of the sheep and the goats? And Jesus said he was going to separate his followers like sheep from goats, true from false, the ones who are truly his followers and the ones who aren't. And he says that he divided them and he put the true on the right and the false on the left. That was backwards, true on the right and false on the left. And then he says in Matthew 25:34, he says, then the king will say to those on his right, come you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from before the foundation of the earth. And so this is exactly what Jesus is teaching about. This group of people who at the final day will be blessed. He said, blessed are the merciful. And these are the people who are going to receive the kingdom of heaven. And here at the final day, he says, come you who are blessed and receive the kingdom. You would think these people are probably merciful, right? And what does he continue to say? He says, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. He says, I was naked and you clothed me. He says, I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Sounds here like the merciful receiving mercy, doesn't it? But there's two things about this. So there's one aspect that you can be merciful in that you can see a need and you can meet it. That you can look to people's personal needs and you can be like, you know what, I care about them. And I will be merciful to them and I'm going to express mercy by doing for them and meeting that need. But there's another kind of mercy, and that's deep in the heart. And that is the mercy that is not judgmental. That is not thinking that you're so good and so great. It's the mercy that offers forgiveness. It's the mercy that just from the heart you look around at people and you have a compassion that you love them and you want to forgive them and care about them just from the heart because you understand that you've received mercy. And you know that Jesus has taught this throughout all of his teaching. And, if you're someone who wants to hold everyone responsible and you're just like, you know what, they wronged me. I wish they would get what they deserved. And you know what? I know that they really make me mad. And I want them to be faced with what they did. And I just want justice to be served to people. And that's your attitude. James says in James 2:13, he says, you know what? He says, judgment will be without mercy to all people who have shown no mercy. He says, if you're someone who's not merciful, he says, you're going to be judged mercilessly. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine standing before Jesus Christ and being judged in a merciless judgment? To be judged without any, forgiveness or mercy involved in your judgment? That would be a terrible way to be judged. And, Jesus teaches this, and this is such a strict teaching. It's such a strict teaching that you almost think, maybe I'm misunderstanding this. It just seems so strong, so strict that how could that actually be? How could it be that people who are not merciful will not receive mercy? It just seems too strong to be true. But this is through all of Jesus' teaching. Remember when we looked at the parable of the unforgiving servant? And remember in Matthew 18:29, this man had been forgiven this great debt from his master. He'd been forgiven a debt that he couldn't pay. And then he went to his co-worker, his fellow servant, who owed him money, and he said, give me my money. He was like, I know I received mercy, but you know what? You weren't really just with me. You weren't fair, so I'm going to start making demands because that's what's fair. And he says, pay me what you owe me. And it says here in verse 29, it says that his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him and said, have patience with me and I'll pay you all. But he said he refused, and he threw him in prison until the debt should be paid. And then it says that all the fellow servants around that saw it, it says that when his fellow servants saw it, it says that they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported everything to the master. So his fellow servants are like, what on earth? This guy just received all this mercy, but he's not merciful. And it says that his master, in anger, summoned him, and he said to him, you wicked servant. He says, I forgave you because you pleaded with me. And then he says this. He says, should you not have had mercy on others as I had mercy on you? He says, shouldn't you? He says, what are you thinking? He says, you're seriously going to ask for mercy when you didn't even give mercy yourself? And it says in his anger, he threw him into prison until the entire debt should be paid. He says that this man who would not give mercy, his master dumped the entire sentence, the maximum sentence out on him because he was merciful. He was unmerciful himself. He wanted mercy, but he wasn't willing to give it. And then Jesus ends this story with the point. He says, so my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from the heart. He says, if you're not merciful, he says, don't think that you're going to strut in and receive mercy from God. He says, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart, neither will my heavenly Father forgive you. And, when James says that judgment is without mercy on those who have not shown mercy, the Bible teaches that, if we have to face someone, if we have to deliver some sort of judgment on someone, it shouldn't be something that we want to do. God himself even says that he has no joy in the judgment of wicked. He says, I'm not a God who enjoys being judgmental. He says, I'm not a God who enjoys punishing the wicked. He says, I am a merciful God who wants to give mercy. And he says that there is no joy in it, and he doesn't want us to become people who find ourselves ready to judge people and wanting to deal out judgment. And in Matthew 7, throughout all of Jesus, this Sermon on the Mount, one thing that I find is crazy is that this keeps coming up over and over. Over and over, Jesus keeps teaching this. I believe he teaches this like 4 times. He says this throughout one message, throughout one Sermon on the Mount. And he says in Matthew 7:1, he says, judge not that you be not judged. And then he says, in the measure in which you judge, you will be judged. And he says, in the strictness you use will be used upon you. He says, if you go around being judgmental to people, how judgmental you are is how judged you are going to be. And he says, in the strictness that you judge people, that's the judgment you're going to receive. Who in their right mind would want to incur greater judgment on themselves? Who would want to live a life that's going to receive greater judgment? Why would anyone choose that road? Why would anyone choose to do that? And if you've seen a lot of Westerns, you've seen this played out before. You see where there's a judge in a town and he judges everybody very strictly. He hangs the most petty of crimes, right? He's just like, there needs to be a line in this town, and this needs to be the standard, and this needs to be how it is. And he says, I'm cleaning up this town. And he's punishing people to this great extreme. But you know how those usually end. When the judge has found out that he himself is a scammer or guilty, that town doesn't waste much time to string him up, do they? because he has dealt out that sort of judgment. And when you live that sort of way, he says, don't expect to receive mercy yourself, because people who are judgmental and merciless shouldn't expect to receive mercy themselves. This is kind of interesting to me, because as I look at this, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. I've heard many, many preachers say, that's not true. That just can't be. Because you just believe in Jesus Christ and accept Jesus Christ and you receive mercy. And I've heard many preachers, and you probably have as well, say that there is no attitude needed to receive salvation. That there's not some special heart condition that is necessary to receive salvation. And they say you don't need to be merciful in order to receive mercy from God. That is not true. But I would kind of beg to differ based on essentially the entire Bible. The fact is that God, it says that he resists the proud, and he resists the arrogant, and he resists the self-centered, and he resists the haughty and prideful, and he doesn't accept them. And if you're saying, man, this is kind of confusing to me, because how many things do you need to do and be to receive salvation? And as we look at all of these attitudes, and you say, what do I need to know to receive salvation? And who do I got to be? How many standards do I got to hold? What does it really boil down to? And I would say it boils down to one thing: humble. Humble. All of these attitudes, it comes down to humble. That you just stand before God and you're like, God, I'm empty and broken before you. Like somebody humble is not going to be saying, oh, judge them. They deserve fire poured down on them. They're going to be like, oh, who am I? Right? When you look at the meek and the lowly and those who mourn and those who, all of these different qualities that Jesus says that you are to have, that you're to be a peacemaker and that you're to be merciful. All of these really boil down to someone who understands they're a sinner and they've humbled themselves before God. It is the humble who just understand that I am guilty. And it's just really one thing that you need to understand is that, like David says, he says that a broken and contrite heart God will not reject. He says that is a sacrifice that God will not turn away. And really it's just that attitude that goes with humility in my mind that all of these characteristics boil down to, and that is what God demands of us. He wants us to come to him and say, God, I am a sinner. And I'm not looking out at you, and I'm not looking out at you or anybody else. And I'm here asking for mercy. And that is the understanding that we need to come to God with. It's not like, oh, we need to do all these special things and there's this huge stack of things we need to fulfill. All of these things are God carefully laying out what it is to be humble before him, so that we understand each individual aspect of that one thing in my mind. And that is what we need to understand. So in closing this morning, as we think about this mercy, Jesus says throughout this Sermon on the Mount, he says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. We looked at a couple other places in here in Matthew 7 where he talks about mercy. We know that when he teaches the Lord's Prayer in this same message, he says that we should pray, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who sin against us. He says that we should even pray in a way that says, I understand that as I give out mercy, I may receive mercy. And then he says here in Matthew 6:14 in the same message, he says, for if you forgive others their wrongs, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your heavenly Father forgive you. And he says over and over and over, do not be the sort of person who walks through this earth swinging that sword like you guys deserve judgment. If somebody walks around and they say, I wish someone would tell them what's what. I wish someone would set them straight. Somebody needs to talk to them. Somebody needs to put them in their place. They need to be held accountable. They need to, you know what? They may stand before Jesus Christ with all their sins laid out before them and be in for a big surprise because they were merciless and they didn't see themselves in an attitude of humility. They are here begging for mercy when they didn't give mercy. Like, this is a huge concept throughout the teachings of Jesus Christ. The merciful shall receive mercy. And I believe that this is those who understand true humility will receive the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to have a closing song this morning. But if there's anything that I could help you with or somehow better understand, just please talk to me about that. And I just hope that this helps you to understand what Jesus Christ asks of us and understand what he wants us to be.